The rain that night didn't fall in hurried drops. It poured as if the sky had been holding its breath for weeks and finally let go in one endless, trembling sigh. Every rooftop in the small city seemed to echo with its rhythm. Streetlights flickered in the haze, their halos blurred into pale gold rings by the sheets of water. Most people hurried indoors, clutching umbrellas that bent in the wind, running from puddle to puddle. But Daniel wasn't running. He was driving, slow, deliberate. Along the nearly empty stretch, between the business district and the quiet outskirts where the roads narrowed and the buildings thinned, the wipers moved back and forth, a steady heartbeat in the silence of the car. He wasn't looking for anything. He never did. His life had been built around schedules, transactions, deals sealed in the glass towers of his world. But that night, he saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the curb, not under any awning, not seeking shelter, just still. The rain soaked her hair into dark strands that clung to her face. Her clothes were faded, not by fashion but by time and wear. A pale dress with the faintest trace of once bright flowers, now muted into soft ghosts of color. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. And in her arms, tucked so close, it seemed like she was trying to shield it from the entire world, was a little cardboard box.
Before we continue, please do subscribe to my channel. He slowed the car without meaning to. Something about her didn't fit the scene. Homelessness was a reality in the city, yes, but there was something in her posture, in the way she sat completely still, like she didn't want to be noticed, but also didn't care if she was. The box in her arms was damp at the edges, yet she clung to it with both hands, as if letting go would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. The rain made the moment surreal. It was as if the whole world had gone quiet except for that. One fragile figure on the curb. Daniel pulled over, told himself it was just curiosity, maybe concern. But when he stepped out into the downpour, the cold bit into him like tiny needles. And every step toward her felt heavier than the last. She didn't look up when his shadow fell over her. Double quotes. "Hey," he said gently, his voice barely carrying over the rain. "It's not safe out here." Her head tilted slightly, just enough for him to see her eyes beneath the wet strands of hair. They were dark, wide, but not frightened. Not exactly. More guarded. The kind of guarded you only see in people who have been let down too many times. "I'm fine," she replied softly, almost politely, as if the conversation were unnecessary. Daniel crouched to her level, his suit trousers immediately soaking. "Through, what's in the box?" he asked. Not out of suspicion, but because she held it like it was alive. For the first time, her fingers shifted slightly on the lid. "It's mine," she said, with quiet finality. He nodded, not pressing. Further, the rainwater dripped from his hair down his neck. "Do you have somewhere to go?" She hesitated. "I was going to." She trailed off, her voice catching just barely. Like she'd realized mid-sentence that telling him anything was a risk. Daniel took a slow breath. "Listen, I'm not here to hurt you. But sitting here in the rain, you'll get sick." Girl glanced toward the dark street ahead of her, then back to him. "People only help because they want something," she murmured. Something in those words landed in his chest heavier than the rain. He could have argued, could have told her she was wrong, but he'd lived long enough, seen enough, to know she was speaking from experience. It's not cynicism. So instead, he simply said, "Then let me prove you wrong." Tailored, far too large for her, and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't resist, but she didn't thank him either. Instead, she glanced down at the coat as if unsure whether accepting it would mean she owed him something later. Daniel stood, offering his hand. "Come on, let's at least get you somewhere warm. You don't have to tell me anything you don't." "Want to?" For a long moment, she didn't move. Rainwater trickled from her chin. Then, with slow reluctance, she shifted the box under one arm and placed her small hand in his. Her fingers were cold, not the kind of cold from a short time outside, but the deep, bone-level chill that came from too many nights without shelter. As they walked toward his car, he noticed she kept her eyes down, almost as if memorizing. The ground, not the man leading her. She slid into the passenger seat cautiously, setting the box on her lap. Even when the heater hummed to life, she didn't open it. Daniel drove without speaking for a while, letting the warmth fill the space between them. He knew better than to push. That trust was a delicate thing, especially for someone like her. Someone who seemed to have learned young that it could be broken without warning. Finally, he asked, "What's your name?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Leah," he smiled faintly. "Leah, that's a beautiful name." She didn't respond, but he noticed her grip on the box loosened slightly, as if the simple act of saying her name aloud had softened something. The rest of the drive was silent, except for the sound of rain easing into a softer drizzle. When they reached the small diner near his building, Daniel pulled into the lot. It was late, but the neon sign still buzzed faintly, casting a warm pink glow on the wet pavement. "Come inside," he said. "They make the best hot chocolate here." Leah followed him in, her small frame swallowed in his coat. The waitress behind the counter gave Daniel a curious look. He was a familiar face. But the sight of him with a soaked little girl was new. She didn't ask questions. Just set 2 mugs on the counter and filled them with steaming cocoa. Leah didn't speak. But the moment she wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, Daniel saw her shoulders drop ever so slightly, like she'd been carrying a weight that, just for a moment, felt lighter. He didn't know yet what her story was, why she'd been out there in the rain, or what she kept in that box. But as he watched her take the first tentative sip, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't going to be the last night. He saw her. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Daniel stepped out of the alley. The air felt heavy, as though the city itself was holding its breath. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. She was still there, sitting on the same step, head bowed, a wet strand of hair plastered to her cheek. He could have kept walking. He should have. But something about her stillness had rooted itself inside him. He took a slow step back toward her. Her small hands were clasped in her lap. Not in a way that asked for help, more like she was holding on to something that no one else could see. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. She lifted her head, her eyes. Daniel had never seen eyes like that. Not simply brown, but deep and still, like they had learned silence before they learned speech. "Hey," he said softly, unsure why his voice had dropped to a whisper. You're soaked. You'll get sick out here." For a moment, she didn't respond, just stared at him as though she were measuring the weight of his presence. Then, in a voice so quiet it could have been mistaken for a thought, she said, "I'm waiting." Daniel frowned. Waiting for who? As she glanced past him, toward the road, slick with rain, as if expecting someone to appear. My friend." "Friend?" Daniel echoed, trying to keep his tone gentle. She nodded once, but he's late. Very late. Daniel's chest tightened. There was a strange precision in her words, as if she had practiced them in her head 100 times, afraid they'd come out wrong. He crouched down so they were at eye level. "How long have you been out here?" Her shoulders rose and fell in. A small shrug. "Since yesterday." The mist in the air suddenly felt colder. Daniel glanced down the street. This was not the part of the city where children sat alone in the rain waiting for late friends, not without bad things finding them first. He tried again. "Do your parents know you're here?" Her lips pressed together in a faint line. Didn't answer. Daniel ran a hand through his damp hair. "Look, I'm not here to scare you. I can't leave you here like this. You must be freezing." Her gaze lowered to his hands. For a strange moment, she seemed fascinated by the way his fingers flexed when he spoke. Then, without looking up, she asked, "Do you have food?" The question caught him off guard. "Food? Yeah. I mean, not here with me, but there's a diner across the street. Warm food, dry seats. We could go." Her head tilted almost as if she were weighing the danger of his offer against the rumbling in her stomach. Finally, she whispered, "What's your name?" "Daniel." He gave a small, reassuring smile. "What's yours?" She hesitated. Then Nia. He let the name settle between them like something fragile. "All right, Nia," he said, extending a hand. "Get you something to eat." She didn't take his hand. Instead, she stood slowly, as though expecting the ground to shift beneath her. When she finally stepped forward, it wasn't toward his hand, but toward the diner's faint neon glow across the street. Daniel followed her, matching his pace to hers. He noticed the way her small frame seemed to disappear into her oversized, soaked sweater, how the hem nearly brushed her knees. She carried herself with a strange mix of weariness and dignity, like she had already walked much farther than he would ever know. The diner door swung open with a chime. Warm air and the smell of coffee washed over them. A couple of truckers glanced up from their meals, then back down again. Daniel gestured toward a booth in the corner. "You can sit there. I'll grab us some menus." Nia slid into the booth without a word, her hands still folded in her lap. Her eyes flicked toward the window, watching the street as though keeping vigil for someone who might still appear. When Daniel sat down opposite her, he noticed something else. Her gaze didn't wander idly. She was scanning, observing. Every person in the diner seemed to pass under her quiet inspection. A waitress approached, her tone brisk, but not unkind. "What can I get you?" Daniel glanced at Nia. "What do you feel like eating?" Nia's fingers tightened against each other. "Soup," she said finally. "And a grilled cheese," Daniel added, handing the menus back. "For both of us." When the waitress left, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "So this friend you're waiting for? You trust him?" Nia's eyes stayed on the rain-streaked window. "I used to." Something in her tone made Daniel's skin prickle. He wanted to ask more, but the waitress returned with steaming bowls of soup, and Nia's attention dropped instantly to the food. She didn't eat quickly, the way most hungry children would. She took small, deliberate bites, as if making the meal last as long as possible. Daniel watched her for a moment, realizing that this, the quiet between words, might be the only way to reach her. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't what he expected. "Why did you come back for me?" Daniel blinked. "What do you mean? You walked away? I saw you. You could have kept going." "But you didn't." He let out a slow breath. "'Cause it didn't feel right to leave you there." Nia considered that. People leave all the time. Her words landed heavier than they should have. And Daniel knew this was not the last conversation. It was only the first. The rain had a way of softening the edges of the city at night, blurring neon signs and quieting the usual chaos. Yet, inside that little diner where the warm lights spilled over the checkered floor, Alex couldn't ignore the faint sound he'd been noticing for days now. A sound that didn't belong to the hum of the fridge or the clink of coffee cups. It was a muffled crying, not loud, not attention-seeking. It was the kind of crying that someone tried to bury deep in their chest, as if the world might get angry if they heard it. And it came from the corner booth, always from her. She would be sitting there with her hood pulled low, pretending to read a battered paperback, sometimes tracing her finger along the lines without turning a page. The tears would well in her eyes, but she'd keep her head down, as though she believed she was invisible. Alex had seen that kind of grief before, the quiet, tired kind that didn't come from one bad day but from many, piled up over years. 4. The first 2 nights he told himself not to intrude. People had a right to their privacy, and yet, something about her sadness didn't feel like it was meant to be carried alone. On the 3rd night, brought over her usual plate, scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and a small bowl of fruit. She never ordered it, but it was what he had. Noticed she ate when she came. He placed it on the table gently, not saying a word, giving her space to decide if she wanted to look up. She didn't, not at first. She just whispered thanks, her voice so soft he barely caught it. But the crying didn't stop. That night, long after the last customer had left, Alex lingered in the diner. The rain had turned heavier, rattling against the glass. She was still there, staring at her untouched tea. Finally, he slid into the booth across from her. She froze. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a second, he thought she might get up and leave. "I'm not here to pry," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I just thought maybe you didn't want to be alone tonight." Her eyes, wide and wary, finally met his. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much too young. "Why?" she asked, almost accusing. Why what? Why do you care? Alex didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure she'd believe the truth, that sometimes you just know when someone's about to drown and you can't stand by. Instead, he said, because I've had nights like yours. I know they're easier when someone just sits across from you, even if they say nothing. Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the smallest lowering of her guard. She didn't tell him. It's her name that night. She didn't tell him what made her cry, but she let him sit there while the rain kept falling. She finally stood to leave. She looked at him for a long moment, as if memorizing his face, and that was the beginning. The crying didn't stop for many nights after that. But now, she wasn't always crying alone. The next morning was quieter than most. The sky hung low with soft, gray clouds, and the wind moved through the narrow streets with the gentlest whisper, as if even the weather didn't want to disturb the town. Aaron walked down the familiar path toward the park. His boots pressed into the damp soil, leaving small, perfect imprints. He carried a paper bag with 2 fresh pastries from the corner bakery, warm enough that their buttery scent curled into the cool morning air. He didn't know if she'd be there. He didn't even know if she wanted to see him, but he knew one thing: yesterday's silence and the way she'd turned her face away had left a weight in his chest that wouldn't go away. She was there. Same bench, same posture, same faraway look. Her hair was a little messier this morning, strands caught in the breeze. She wore the same oversized coat, zipped all the way up. Her hands tucked deep into the sleeves. Aaron slowed as he approached, the bag of pastry suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. "Morning," he said softly. She looked at him just for a second, then back down at her lap. Aaron swallowed. I brought something." He sat a few feet away from her, leaving the same cautious distance as before. He opened the bag, the warm, sweet scent spilling out between them. "They're from that bakery near the church. It's the one that sells out before noon." No answer. He tore one pastry in half and placed it carefully on a napkin between them. "Hey, figured maybe you didn't eat yet." For a long moment she didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. But then, almost imperceptibly, her hand reached out. Fingers brushing the napkin, she took the piece. Turning it over once in her hand before taking the smallest bite, Aaron waited. "Sorry," they blurted, the word coming out more abrupt than he'd meant. Her chewing slowed, and she glanced at him. About last time," he continued, his voice gentler now. "For stepping in, for acting like I knew your story when I don't." She blinked, still silent. "I thought I was helping," Aaron admitted. "But maybe I was just making things worse." The girl looked at him for a long time, really looked, and for the first time, Aaron could see how young she truly was. Not in her clothes or her stature, but in the way her eyes seemed to carry too much for someone her age. "You didn't make it worse," she said finally, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. Aaron felt something loosen in his chest. She took another bite of the pastry, chewing slowly. She hesitated. "I'm not used to people noticing me. When they do, it's not always for the right reasons." Aaron nodded. I get that." Her eyes flicked to him briefly, as if deciding whether or not to believe him. They ate in quiet for a few moments. The breeze tugged at the napkin between them, and Aaron caught it before it blew away. "You come here every morning?" he asked. She gave a tiny shrug. "Sometimes. Depends. Depends on what? On whether I can sleep." Something in her tone made Aaron's chest tighten again. There was no bitterness there, just a tired honesty that weighed more than anger ever could. He wanted to ask 100 questions. Where she lived. Why she seemed so alone. What had happened to make her eyes carry that storm? But he didn't. Instead, he said, "Well, if you're here tomorrow, maybe I'll bring the other kind, the ones with chocolate in the middle." Corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. When she finished her half of the pastry, she brushed the crumbs from her lap and stood. "Thanks," she said quietly. Aaron stood too. "Anytime." She started to walk away, but halfway down the path she stopped, turned, "What's your name, Aaron?" She nodded. "Okay." And then she walked on, disappearing between the trees, her small figure blending into the gray. Morning. Aaron stood there for a moment longer, the empty paper bag crinkled in his hand. It wasn't much, a few words, a shared pastry, flicker of almost a smile, but it felt like the first small crack in a wall that had been built for far too long. That night, as the rain began to tap gently against his apartment window, Aaron found himself thinking of her again, not the silence, not the guarded look, but the fact that she'd turned back to ask his name. And for the first time in a while, the thought didn't just make him curious, it made him hopeful. The mornings in early winter had a certain kind of silence, soft, almost fragile. The air hung still, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke from houses that had already lit their fireplaces. It was in these mornings that something quiet but undeniable began to change between Adam and Alina. It started with coffee. The first time was almost accidental. Adam had woken up early, long before the sun touched the rooftops, and decided to make himself a cup. He found Alina sitting at the small kitchen table, her hair a sleepy mess, her hands wrapped around a half-empty mug she'd probably been nursing for a while. She didn't notice him at first, not until he placed a steaming cup in front of her. She looked up, eyes cautious, as though wondering if there was some hidden meaning behind the gesture. But Adam just smiled, a small, tired kind of smile. "It's too early to be up without coffee," he said simply. She didn't thank him right away. She took a slow sip, as if tasting not just the drink, but the sincerity behind it. "It's good," she murmured after a moment, "not too bitter." Then, "I must have done something right," he replied. From then on, they began meeting there in the half-light before the day really started. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but even in the silence, there was a growing ease in, unspoken agreement that these early hours belonged to them. One morning, she came in wearing his old sweatshirt. Adam noticed immediately, but he didn't comment on it. There was something about the way she held herself in it loose, comfortable, that made him not want to ruin the moment by pointing it out. Instead, he poured her coffee and slid it across the table like always. "Thanks," she said softly, her fingers brushing against his for just a second. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it stayed with him long after. It wasn't just the coffee. Some mornings he made toast. Other mornings, she surprised him by quietly frying eggs before he came in. She never asked if he wanted any, just left a plate for him at his usual spot. He noticed that she never stayed to watch him eat. She would busy herself at the sink, or pretend to be reading something on her phone, as if the kindness needed to be given quietly, without being acknowledged. Adam wondered if this was her way of saying sorry for things she still didn't know how to put into words. Or maybe it wasn't about apologies at all. Maybe it was simply the beginning of something new. One day, it rained. The sound of it against the window filled the room, a soft and steady rhythm. Adam was pouring milk into her coffee when she asked, almost absent-mindedly, "Do you always get up this early?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Habit, I guess. I like the quiet before the day starts." She nodded. "Me too. But I didn't before. What changed?" "You," she said, and her voice was so low, he almost thought he imagined it. He didn't know what to say after that, so he just handed her the coffee and let the rain fill the silence between them. By the third week of these shared mornings, the air between them had shifted completely. They still had their boundaries, neither of them pushed too far, too fast, but there was no denying that something was healing. It was in the way they sometimes stood close without stepping away, in the way she no longer avoided his eyes, and in the way he no longer spoke like every word had to be measured. One morning, Adam caught her smiling to herself while looking out the window. It was small, fleeting, but real. "What's funny?" he asked as she turned toward him, her eyes lighter than he'd seen in months. "Nothing. Just, it's nice." "This you?" He felt something in his chest tighten, not in the way it used to when she heard him, but in the way that made him afraid of losing what was finally beginning to grow between them. But not every morning was perfect. There were days when she seemed distant again, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. Days when Adam woke to find the kitchen empty, her coffee cup untouched. On those mornings, the quiet felt heavier, and he'd catch himself wondering if maybe it was all just temporary. If one day the seat across from him would be empty for good. Yet without fail, she always returned. Sometimes she'd offer no explanation. Sometimes she'd mumble something about not sleeping well. But she came back, and somehow, that was enough. One particularly cold morning, Adam found her already in the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee waiting. "On the table? You beat me to it," he said, surprised. She smiled faintly. "Thought I'd give you a break." He sat down, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "It's good," he said after a sip. "Not too bitter?" she asked with the faintest teasing tone. "Perfect," he replied. For the first time, they both laughed, not a forced laugh, not a polite one, but the kind that warmed the air and made the morning feel alive. Adam didn't realize until later that it was the first time they had laughed together in months. It was on mornings like these that Adam started to believe they might really be okay. Not yet, not completely. But someday, the diner windows, usually, still in the early dawn, began to shiver faintly against a wind that rolled in from somewhere far away. Out beyond the parking lot, the clouds were bruised and heavy, hanging so low it felt like you could almost touch them. The air carried that metallic scent that always comes before rain, as though the whole world is holding its breath. Waiting for something to break, Marianne was behind the counter, polishing a mug that was already spotless, though she'd never admit it. The boy was in his usual booth, knees tucked up, sketching on a piece of scrap paper she'd slipped him from the order pad. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly in the hush, and every now and then they'd exchange a quiet glance. "You hear that?" she asked, nodding toward the rattle of the windows. He didn't speak, just tilted his head like a wild animal, listening for something deeper than sound. Then he gave the smallest nod, his eyes returning to the pencil lines taking shape on the page. It started as a gentle tapping, the first drops of rain, but quickly the sound grew heavier, drumming against the roof like restless fingers. Outside, the wind caught a stray napkin from the trash bin and sent it spinning in mad circles before it disappeared into the dark. Marianne stepped away from the counter and moved toward the boy's booth. "You walk here?" she asked, even. Though she already knew the answer, he looked up at her, hesitant, and then gave another tiny nod. She glanced toward the door, her jaw tightening. "Well, you're not walking home in this." His gaze flicked toward the windows, and for the first time that morning, she saw it, a ripple of fear, so quick she might have missed it. He wasn't afraid of the storm, not exactly. No, it was the thought of being stuck somewhere, being noticed. It's that unsettled him. Lightning flashed, flooding the diner with pale blue light for an instant, and in that brief illumination, Marianne caught the damp glisten of his eyelashes. "Hey," she said softly, crouching a little so she could meet his eyes. "It's just rain. You'll stay here until it stops, all right?" He hesitated, his pencil frozen mid-stroke. Then he gave a reluctant nod, as though agreeing to something that cost him more than he wanted to admit. The hours slowed, the world outside dissolving into a blur of streaked glass and silver rivulets. Every so often, thunder would roll through, low, deep, and endless, like the earth was clearing its throat. Inside, the diner felt smaller, warmer, wrapped in the hum of the coffee machine and the quiet clink of Marianne setting a fresh cup in front of him. She didn't ask him questions. She had learned by now that words had to be earned with him, not pulled. Instead, she sat across from him with her own coffee, pretending to read the local paper, but mostly watching the way his small hand moved over the page. He wasn't just drawing. He was telling himself something in shapes and lines, something safer than speaking it aloud. When the wind hit the diner full on, making the lights flicker, he flinched hard enough that his pencil broke. Marianne's hand moved without thinking, covering his. "It's all right," she murmured. "We're inside. Storm can't touch us here." He blinked up at her, and in that moment the mask he wore, the one of quiet endurance, slipped. Just a little. She saw the exhaustion there, the way every sound seemed to pull him backward into some place she couldn't see. They sat like that for a while, the storm pressing against the walls, testing them, finding no way in. By the time the rain began to ease, The boy's sketch lay finished on the table. Marianne leaned over, her eyes softening when she realized what it was: the diner, drawn from the outside, with light spilling from its windows into the dark. Inside, two small figures sat across from each other, safe from the storm. Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she slid the paper back toward him. "It's good," she said simply. He shrugged. But there was a flicker in his eyes, something like pride, when the clouds finally broke and the streets glistened under a thin, cold sun. Marianne walked him to the door. The air still smelled of rain, and puddles mirrored the washed-out sky. He stepped outside slowly, almost reluctantly, as though leaving that booth meant stepping back into a world that didn't care whether he was dry or warm. Marianne watched him go, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. She told herself it was just a storm, just a boy waiting it out. But deep down, she knew storms didn't always come from the sky. It was the kind of morning that carried the scent of rain even before the clouds decided to let go. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken promise of storms later in the day, and the streets outside looked like they had been washed in a soft, silvery light. Inside the little diner, warmth clung to the corners, steam drifting gently above the coffee pots, the faint hum of the refrigerator blending with the quiet rhythm of a broom. Sweeping in the back, Evelyn was wiping down the counter when the soft chime of the door broke the stillness. She glanced up, expecting one of the regulars. Maybe someone looking for a quick cut before work, but instead, she saw him, Daniel. He walked in with that same quiet presence he always had, hands deep in his jacket pockets, eyes down, steps almost hesitant. But something was different this time. He didn't carry the same invisible weight on his shoulders. There was still sadness in him, yes, but today there was also something else, something almost careful, and then she saw it, tucked under his arm was a book hardcover, old enough that its once bright jacket had faded into muted tones. A length of red satin ribbon peeked out from between the pages. Catching the light as he moved, "Morning," he murmured, voice softer than usual. "Morning, Daniel," she said, her smile carrying both warmth and curiosity. "Coffee?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Please, please." She poured the steaming liquid into his usual mug and set it down in front of him, noticing how his gaze kept drifting toward the book. Finally, she couldn't hold back. "That's new, or maybe old," she said, nodding toward it. He glanced at it, his fingers brushing over the ribbon, as though it were made of something fragile. "It's my mother's," he said slowly. Or it was. Evelyn froze for just a fraction of a second, sensing the fragility of the moment. "Is it a novel?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Not exactly. It's a journal." Her journal. The words seemed to echo in the quiet space between them. Evelyn's hand stilled over the counter, and she leaned in slightly, not out of intrusion, but in that way people do when they know they're being trusted with something rare, I found. "It last night," he said, his eyes fixed on the cup of coffee as though it was safer than looking directly at her. "It was in a box I hadn't opened in years." She used to write about everything, little moments, thoughts, things she noticed. The ribbon. It was always where she'd last left off. Evelyn's gaze softened. "And you read it?" Nodded, the faintest shadow of a smile touching his lips. "Just a few pages. I'd forgotten how much she noticed things, like the way sunlight came through the kitchen window in the mornings, or how the sound of rain made her want to bake bread," she wrote like. She loved the world, even when life wasn't kind to her. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She had learned by now that Daniel's silences carried more weight than most people's words. This wasn't just about the journal, it was about him. Remembering a kind of love and attention to life that he thought he'd lost. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the book. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he slid it toward her. She opened it carefully, as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. The pages were lined with neat handwriting, slightly slanted, each word holding the kind of care that spoke of patience. Between two entries, a pressed flower lay flattened, its petals still faintly golden, after all these years. Evelyn's fingertips hovered over it but didn't touch. It felt too sacred. She used to put those in there whenever she saw something she wanted to remember, Daniel said quietly. Said flowers were just memories you could hold in. Your hands for a little while? Evelyn looked up at him, her chest warming with something she couldn't quite name. She sounds extraordinary. She was, he replied simply, but there was a tremor in the way he said it, as if the word wasn't nearly enough. They sat like that for a while, her reading small fragments. Him watching the way she treated each page like it mattered. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the windows, soft and rhythmic, as though nature itself was leaning in to listen. When Evelyn closed the book and slid it back to him, she did so with both hands, like returning a precious heirloom. You should keep reading it, she said. Not all at once, just when you need to remember her voice. Daniel nodded, his hand lingering on the cover. I think I will. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the glass. Somewhere in the back, the old clock ticked in steady measure. For a moment, the diner felt like it existed outside of time, just a people. A book with a ribbon, and the quiet comfort of knowing that some memories, when shared, grow even more alive. When he finally left, the ribbon still peeked out from the book's pages, and Evelyn watched him step into the rain, wondering how something as small as a journal could open a door inside someone's heart, and maybe it had opened one in hers too. The morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen table like a warm blanket, making the edges of their teacups gleam. The rainstorm from the night before had left the world smelling clean, fresh soil, damp leaves, and that quiet stillness that always came after the sky had poured itself out. Leah sat at the table with her hair tied loosely in a braid, strands falling out around her face. She wasn't looking at her tea, though. She was staring at the notebook in front of her, tapping her pencil against the edge like her thoughts were too loud to sit still. Across from her, Aaron was cutting slices of bread, slow and precise. It always moved with that kind of patience, like nothing in the world could rush him. But he'd been watching her, catching the way her gaze drifted between the notebook and the window, as if something out there was calling her. What's in your head? He finally asked, his voice low and unhurried. She looked up, startled for just a second, then gave a little smile that wasn't quite ready to bloom. An idea, she said softly, for something new, something I've never done before. Set the knife down and leaned forward, elbows on the table. Leah hesitated. She had been thinking about this for days, but saying it out loud made it feel fragile, like it could disappear if spoken too soon. I want to start a small community garden, she said finally. Here, in the empty lot by the library. Aaron's brow lifted. A garden? Yes, she said, her voice growing a little more certain. It's just sitting there, nothing but weeds and broken bottles. But it could be beautiful. Flowers, herbs, vegetables, a place people could come and take what they need, no questions asked. For a moment, Aaron didn't speak. Leah's fingers tightened around her pencil. Then he smiled, the slow kind of smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. You've already thought about how to do it, haven't you? Leah's shoulders relaxed a little. I have drawn a plan or two, and she had. In her notebook, neat little sketches filled the pages, rows of marigolds to keep pests away, raised beds for vegetables, a small bench shaded by sunflowers. She'd even thought about where rainwater barrels could go, and how to involve the local school children in planting. Darn reached across the table, gently pulling the notebook toward him. He studied the drawings like they were something rare. You've made a map, he murmured. Not a map, Leah said softly. Wish. Outside, a pair of doves landed on the windowsill, cooing in that soft, unhurried way birds do when they know they're safe. Do you think it's foolish? She asked after a moment. Aaron looked up from the pages, his gaze steady. No, I think it's exactly the kind of thing this town needs, and I think it's exactly the kind of thing you need too. Leah swallowed, her throat tightening. In that way it did when something inside her felt seen. They spent the rest of the morning talking about it, where to get soil, how to gather volunteers, which seeds would grow best in this climate. Aaron suggested reaching out to the local grocer for leftover produce boxes to compost. Leah, her pencil dancing across the page, made a list of everything they'd need to get started. By the time the sun was high, the idea no longer felt fragile. It felt alive. That afternoon they walked together to the empty lot. The grass was waist-high in places, littered with rusted cans and crumpled paper. But Leah didn't see the mess. She saw where the lavender could grow, where the children could kneel in the dirt with their tiny gloves, where the air could smell of basil and rosemary in the summer. Aaron stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "It's going to take work," he said, glancing at the broken fence and the weeds. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, "but I've worked through worse." The wind caught her braid, lifting loose strands around her face. Aaron watched her for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something smaller packet of seeds. "Sunflowers," he said simply. "Thought we could start here?" Leah smiled, and it wasn't the hesitant kind this time. In the days that followed, the garden project became their shared rhythm. Each morning, they met at the lot, clearing trash, cutting back weeds, marking where the beds would go. Aaron's hands were strong with the shovel, steady as he drove fence, posts into the ground. Leah moved with quiet determination, her palms blistering but her spirit lifting with each small change they made. People began to notice. An older woman from the bakery brought a tray of muffins one morning and stayed to help plant. A teenage boy from the hardware store showed up with a bag of nails and a hammer. Even the librarian came by, carrying a box of seed packets she'd had in her attic for years. Leah watched it all unfold like something blooming in real time, not just the soil, but the way strangers became neighbors when given a reason to work. Side by side, one evening, as they were packing up their tools, Aaron glanced toward the half-finished beds and said, "You know, you've started something bigger than just a garden." Leah brushed the dirt from her hands. "Maybe," she said quietly, "or maybe I just needed to plant something that could grow." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the sunflower seeds again and handed them to her. "Then, let's make sure it grows tall enough to be seen from every street in town." Leah took the packet, feeling the weight of it, not just the seeds, but everything they'd built together in these days. And for the first time in a long while, she felt that what she was building might last. The morning had been quiet to quiet. Even the air inside the little coffee shop felt heavier, as if the walls knew something was about to change. Jacob had just finished stacking fresh muffins on the display counter when he saw her at first. She was only a figure in the glass door slim, draped in a faded coat, hair pulled back into a careless bun. But when the sunlight hit her face, Jacob froze. It was her. It was her. Lena's mother. He had only seen her once before, in a photograph tucked into the back of Lena's journal. Back then, Lena had pointed at the picture with a mixture of longing and bitterness, saying, "She left before I turned 9. She didn't even look back." Now, that same woman stood outside the shop, cup glancing in through the glass as if unsure whether she should enter. Jacob's hands tightened around the coffee pot. The bell over the door jingled when she finally stepped inside, her eyes darting around until they landed on the corner table, Lena's table. But Lena wasn't here yet. "Hi, can I help you?" Jacob asked, his voice steady, though something in his chest pounded harder with each second. She hesitated. "I'm looking for a girl. She might come here often. About 17, dark hair, always carrying books." "That's Lena," Jacob replied, his tone clipped. "And you are?" "I'm her mother," she said softly, as though the title might open a door between them. Jacob studied her. There was no denying the resemblance. It's the same sharp jawline, the same eyes that looked like they'd seen too much of the world. But there was also a tiredness in her face, a layer of years gone wrong. Before Jacob could respond, the door swung open again. Lena stepped in, brushing raindrops from her hair. She froze mid-step, her eyes locking on the woman by the counter. Silence. The kind of silence that makes time feel like it's holding its breath. "Lena." Her mother whispered, her voice cracking. Lena's shoulders stiffened. "Why are you here?" Her tone wasn't angry, it was worse. It was cold. I came to see you. To explain. Explain. Lena let out a hollow laugh. It's been 8 years. You don't get to explain now. Jacob glanced between them, sensing the walls of the coffee shop shrinking. Other customers were pretending not to listen, their eyes fixed on their cups, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Her mother stepped forward, clutching a worn scarf in her hands. I made mistakes. I was sick, Lena. I thought leaving was the only way you thought. Lena cut in sharply. You didn't ask me. You didn't stay. You just vanished. Her mother's eyes glistened. I never stopped thinking about you. Lena's voice trembled. Then why didn't you come back sooner? Jacob felt an ache rise in his chest. He wanted to step in to protect her, but this wasn't his battle. Still, he moved closer, placing a quiet cup of tea in front of Lena as if to anchor her to the present. Her mother looked at him briefly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Are you her friend? Jacob said simply, with a steadiness that made Lena glance at him. And right now, she doesn't owe you anything. The words hung heavy in the air. Her mother blinked, as if absorbing the blow, then turned back to Lena. I'm staying at the boarding house on Main Street. If you want to talk, I'll be there. She waited for a reply, but Lena said nothing. After a long moment, her mother left. The bell over the door chiming one last time, the quiet that followed was deafening. Lena sank into the chair, staring at the untouched tea. I don't know if I hate her, or if I'm just murmured. Jacob sat across from her. You don't have to decide today. Her eyes lifted to meet his. But if I don't talk to her now, maybe I never will. Outside, the rain picked up, streaking the windows with silver lines. Somewhere between the past and the present, Lena sat. Caught between the girl who had been abandoned and the young woman deciding if forgiveness was something she could give. Jacob didn't push. He just stayed there, quiet, letting her breathe. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't the anger. It's the wondering, what if this is the last chance? It began subtly, like a faint change in the wind before a storm. Not in the weather, but in her. Elliot noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The diner was unusually quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle sizzle from the grill. Outside, leaves shivered in the breeze, but inside she was sitting. By the window, her chin resting on her palm, eyes distant. Normally, she'd be bent over her sketchbook or sipping tea, but that morning she wasn't moving much. Even when he slid into the seat across from her, she only looked up after a long pause. Morning, he said softly, as if greeting a skittish bird. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Morning, he studied her, noting the pale hue beneath her skin, the faint shadows under her eyes. Did you sleep? She shrugged a little, and almost too quickly. I'm fine. But she wasn't. He could see it in the way her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve. Something had shifted in her, and though she didn't speak of it, the weight of it lingered in the air between them. That afternoon when the rain began, soft at first, then heavy, the diner felt even more like a cocoon. He watched her serve coffee to a couple in the corner, her movements slower, her voice quieter than usual. By the time her shift ended, the rain had deepened into a steady downpour. He offered her his jacket, but she shook her head. You'll get wet, she murmured. I'll survive, he replied, draping it over her shoulders anyway. You look like you need it more. Right. For a moment she didn't resist, but as they walked, she seemed somewhere else. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them, and he didn't push her to talk. It wasn't until later that evening, when they sat on the old couch in her apartment, that she finally spoke. You ever feel, she began slowly, like no matter how much you try, the past still reaches for you? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Yes, she glanced at him, almost surprised by his quick answer. I thought maybe I was just being dramatic, she said softly. You're not, he replied. Sometimes the past has long arms. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of telling him something more. But then she shook her head. It's nothing. I'm just tired. He wanted to ask, tired from what? Tired from who? But he didn't. He just nodded, letting her have the safety of her silence. The next few days were the same. She was still there, still present, but not in the same way. When she laughed, it was smaller. When she worked, it was quieter. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she'd stare out the window with a faraway look, her hand drifting unconsciously to the small silver pendant she wore around her neck. It was as if she was bracing for something. One evening, after closing the diner together, they lingered in the parking lot. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet pavement. She stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself. "You ever notice?" she said suddenly. "How sometimes the air changes before something happens." He looked at her carefully. "Yeah, I've noticed." She met his gaze, and for just a heartbeat, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of guarded anticipation. "Something's changing," she whispered, almost to herself. 2 days later, the change made itself known. They were sitting in their usual booth when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and all the color drained from her face. "Who is it?" he asked, but she didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling as she set the phone down. Screen face down on the table. "Just someone I haven't heard from in a long time." "Good someone or bad someone?" he asked gently. Her silence was answer enough. That night, she didn't linger over tea or talk about books. She walked home faster than usual, and when they reached her door, she gave him a small, distracted smile. "Thanks for walking me," she said, already unlocking the door. He didn't press her, any time. But as he walked back alone, the air felt heavier, the streetlights casting sharper shadows. Something in her life had been stirred, and whatever it wasn't small. Over the next week, the shift in her became more visible. She was more cautious, more withdrawn, like someone expecting an uninvited guest. She kept her phone close but rarely answered it. One afternoon, he caught her flinching when a car slowed near the diner. She tried to mask it with a smile. But he saw the truth. He didn't know yet who or what had reached into her life again, but he could feel it. The air around her wasn't just different now. It was charged like a storm waiting to break. One night, as the rain fell outside and the streetlights glowed faintly through her curtains, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, an unopened letter beside her. "Not going to read it?" he asked. She shook her head. "I already know what it says. Then why keep it?" Her eyes softened, but her voice was steady, because sometimes you need to hold the warning in your hands so you remember what you're up against. And with that, she pushed the letter into a drawer, as if locking away the very thing that had unsettled her. But Elliot knew a locked drawer doesn't keep the storm from coming. The day began as most did, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen and the soft hum of the city beyond the apartment windows. Daniel sat at the small table, a stack of papers in front of him, though his eyes kept drifting toward the quiet hum of footsteps in the hallway. She appeared a moment later, hair still damp from her shower, wearing a pale sweater that made her seem softer, almost fragile. She paused at the sight of him, as though sensing his thoughts had been circling her all morning. "Morning," she murmured, sliding into the seat across from him. "Morning." His voice was casual, but the way his fingers tapped against the edge of the table betrayed a certain nervous energy. He had been waiting for the right moment, though right felt elusive lately. The apartment felt different since her mother's brief and bitter return. It was as if the air itself had shifted. The silence carried more weight. Her smiles were rarer. And he could see a certain tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "How's the writing?" she asked, nodding toward the papers. He glanced down. The truth was, the words had been stubborn these past few days. Coming along, he lied, because she didn't need to carry his creative frustrations on top of her own. Burdens, actually. "I wanted to talk to you about something else." Her brow lifted slightly, cautious but curious. "Something else?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, taking a breath. He wasn't one to rush into offers without thinking, but this had been turning over in his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about what's next for you. About stability, security." Her eyes narrowed, the hint of wariness returning. "I'm fine, Daniel." "I know you are," he said quickly. "But I also know you've been working at that cafe 6 days a week, studying when you can, barely sleeping. Some nights, you deserve better than just getting by. She stared at him for a long moment before looking down at her hands. Getting by is still better than what it was before. I'm not questioning that, he said gently. But what if? I told you there was a way for you to focus on what you really want, without burning yourself out, just to keep the lights on? Her fingers stilled against the tabletop. What exactly are you saying? Daniel hesitated, searching for the right words. I want to offer you a position. With me, I'm starting a new project. Something bigger than what I've been doing before. I could use someone who's organized, thoughtful, and someone I trust. I could pay you enough that you wouldn't need the cafe job anymore. For a moment, she didn't move at all. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the silence between them. You want me to work for you? She asked at last, her tone almost unreadable. Yes, he said simply. I want you to be my assistant, maybe even a collaborator. You'd help with research, scheduling, correspondence, the things I can't always keep up with while I'm writing. And he hesitated, but pressed on. It would mean more time here. Less rushing around, more breathing room. Searched his face as though trying to determine if there was some hidden meaning. Why are you doing this, Daniel? He didn't flinch. Because I believe in you. And because I've seen what you're capable of, even in passing moments. You could do more than survive. I think you could thrive. The words seemed to hang between them. She swallowed, glancing away toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was soft and golden, spilling across the buildings. I don't want charity, she said quietly. It's not charity, he replied. Leaning forward, it's an opportunity. You'd be working for every cent. I wouldn't expect anything less. Something flickered in her eyes. Doubt, hope, fear, all tangled together. She bit her lip, then shook her head slightly. Don't know, Daniel. It feels strange. I've always been the one who has to handle things on my own. Maybe it's time to let someone stand beside you, he said, his voice low but steady. The silence stretched again. Finally, she rose from her seat, moving toward the window, as if she needed the distance to think. He watched her shoulders rise and fall with each slow breath. Can I think about it? She asked, without turning around. Of course, he said at once. Take as long as you need. When she finally glanced back at him, there was the faintest trace of a smile, hesitant but real. You make things sound so easy sometimes, he chuckled softly. They're rarely easy, but they're worth trying for. She gave a small nod before retreating down the hall, leaving him alone with the fading light and the lingering hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd say yes. If you'd like, can continue directly with part 12, the decision, where she finally gives her answer and things start to change between them. Part 11, the offer. It was late afternoon when he returned from work, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight. The golden light spilling through the windows painted the small apartment in warm hues, but it couldn't reach the heaviness in his eyes. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch, carefully sewing a small tear in her coat. The rhythmic motion of the needle through fabric was calming in, till she looked up and noticed him standing in the doorway, unusually still. Long day? She asked softly, her voice cautious, almost testing the waters of his mood. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his briefcase down by the door and loosened his tie. He glanced around the apartment at the small table with its mismatched chairs, at the little vase of wildflowers she'd picked that morning. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. I've been thinking, he began, the words slow, deliberate, about your situation. Her hand stilled on the coat. The phrase "your situation" made her stomach tighten. She hated being reduced to that, the girl with the half-finished education, the girl who had nowhere else to go, the girl who had slipped into his life without planning it. He walked over, taking a seat across from her. There was no desk between them now, no cafe counter, no street corner, just the two of them in the quiet. I have a project, continued, leaning forward slightly. A new one. It's not work, not exactly. Something personal. I could use your help. Her brow furrowed. Help with what? He smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. There's a community center on the east side, old building, almost forgotten. I've been thinking of funding its renovation. They run programs for kids' art classes, reading circles, music lessons. It's all volunteer-based. I don't have the time to be there every day, but he paused, studying her reaction. You could, she blinked, surprised. Me. You've got patience, he said simply. Kids like you and you. He hesitated, searching for the right word. You know what it feels like to need a safe place? I think you'd be good at it. Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to people seeing her in that light, not as a burden, but as someone capable of giving something back. But along with the unexpected warmth of his words came a pang of fear. Why? She asked quietly, Why are you doing this for me? He didn't flinch. Because you've been surviving for too long. You should have the chance to build something instead. The sentence hit her harder than she expected. She looked down at her lap, running her fingers over the rough fabric of her coat. She thought of the nights she had cried quietly into a pillow so as not to wake him. She thought of mornings where coffee was her only anchor. She thought of how different life had been before he'd noticed her on that rain-soaked street. Don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. No one ever is, he said gently. That's why you start before you think you can. The air between them was heavy, but not cold. She didn't give him an answer, but she didn't say no. Either he seemed to sense that was enough for now. I'll take you there tomorrow, he said as he rose from the couch. Just to see the place, no pressure. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while rain tapped softly against the window. She imagined a room filled with crayons and laughter, of small hands tugging at her sleeve, of stories read, aloud in warm corners. She imagined, though she wouldn't say it out loud, what it would feel like to matter to someone who wasn't him, when sleep finally claimed her. It was gentler than usual. The rain that night was steady but soft, the kind that tapped gently against the windows like an insistent whisper. Inside her apartment, the glow from a single lamp painted the walls in warm amber, leaving the corners in shadow. Amelia sat cross-legged on the couch, a mug of chamomile tea cradled between her palms. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet. Usually, she liked that. Silence had been her armor for years, her refuge from a world that had taken too much and offered too little. But lately, she found herself listening for sounds that weren't there. The low rumble of Michael's laugh, the faint scuff of his shoes as he walked in from the rain, or even just his voice reading something aloud in that patient, steady way of his. It startled her, the realization that she missed him. They had been spending more time together in the past few months, first at the cafe, then walks home, then helping with her little art exhibition. At first, she thought it was just kindness, maybe guilt from his own past. But the moments between them had started to blur into something more. Something unspoken but present in every glance, every accidental brush of hands, every pause before goodbye. She stared into her tea, watching the steam swirl upward like ghostly ribbons. The thought she'd been avoiding began to take shape in her mind. She liked him, not just in the comfortable way she liked her few friends, not in the polite, surfacely vela warmth she gave to people who were kind to her. This was different. Was the kind of liking that felt dangerous, the kind that made her heart lurch when she caught sight of him in a crowd, the kind that made her want to tell him things she had never dared tell anyone. It terrified her. Love, or anything like it, had never been safe for her. Her past had taught her that trust was the first step toward loss. She had built walls, high and unyielding, convinced that if she kept everyone at arm's length, she couldn't be hurt. Michael, without meaning to, had been quietly dismantling those walls. Brick by brick. She set her mug down and pulled the knitted blanket tighter around herself. The rain outside grew louder, and in its rhythm, her mind slipped into memories. The night she first saw him standing awkwardly at the cafe counter, the way he had noticed her sadness without prying. The book he gave her, wrapped in a ribbon, with that careful, almost old-fashioned handwriting inside. The day he told her about the art program, his eyes bright with the kind of belief she had never expected to see, aimed at her. She realized she had been holding those moments close, replaying them, letting them soften her. She had been letting him in without even deciding to. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sound startled her enough that she flinched. She reached for it, and her heart tripped when she saw his name on the screen. "Hey, I know it's late, but I saw something today and thought of you." Attached was a photo, a street mural, painted in bold, swirling colors. In the middle was a girl holding an umbrella, standing in a pool of light while rain poured down all around her. Beneath it, in small letters, someone had painted, "You're not forgotten." She stared at the image, her fingers resting lightly on the screen. A lump rose in her throat. Her reply was simple. "It's beautiful. Thank you for sending it." Seconds later, his response came, "You're welcome. I just thought. Maybe you needed to see it tonight." She put her phone down, but she didn't move from the couch. She sat there, staring into the dim room, her heart unsteady. He knew not everything. She hadn't told him all of it, but somehow he knew when she was struggling. He noticed when the world felt too heavy. He cared in a way that wasn't performative, in a way that felt steady, safe, and that was when it hit her fully, like a quiet truth slipping into place. She was falling for him, not because he had saved her. She was learning how to save herself. Not because he had shown her kindness, though he had endlessly. It was because he saw her, really saw her. And instead of turning away from the broken pieces, he stayed. The realization brought with it both warmth and fear. What if she told him and it changed everything? What if she didn't tell him, and the feeling grew too big to keep inside? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She hesitated, then stood and padded barefoot across the small apartment. When she opened the door, there he was, Michael, hair damp from the rain, holding a paper bag in one hand. "I was nearby," he said, smiling sheepishly. "And I remembered you said you hadn't eaten dinner yet." She stepped aside without thinking, letting him in. As he unpacked containers of warm food onto her counter, she felt the quiet shift again, that soft pull between them like gravity, working in slow motion. Maybe, she thought, love wasn't always a hurricane. Maybe sometimes it was the steady fall of rain outside, and someone showing up at your door just because they thought you might be hungry. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let it in. The dawn crept gently over the city, soft and pale, as if it too knew this morning was different. Evan sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands that had long gone cold. His thoughts swirled, heavy and fragile all at once, like paper boats on dark water. Upstairs, Lila stirred. He could hear her soft footsteps as she padded toward the stairs, the old wood creaking under her light weight. She appeared in the doorway wearing that oversized sweater. He'd given her one cold evening, the one she claimed felt like a hug, even when he wasn't around. "Morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. He smiled faintly. "Morning." "Why?" For a while neither spoke. She curled into the chair across from him, tucking her knees up, gazing at the light pooling through the curtains. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind of quiet that came when words weren't needed, yet both knew they couldn't stay unsaid forever. "I heard from her," Lila said suddenly, not looking at him. Evan's chest tightened. "Your mother?" She nodded. "She wants me to come live with her. Says she's ready to try again." The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Seagull cried faintly outside, though the shore was miles away. "And what do you want?" he asked gently. Lila took a deep breath, her fingers worrying the edge of the sweater sleeve. "I don't know. It's a part of me. I want to give her that chance. But displace you. It's the first time I've felt safe, like I belonged somewhere." Her voice trembled. "I don't want to lose that." Evan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You won't lose it. No matter where you are, you'll still have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, small and shaky. "You mean that? More than anything?" They sat like that for a while, fingers linked, letting the moment stretch. Outside, the city woke buses rumbled past. A shopkeeper rolled up a metal shutter, the air carrying the faint scent of bread from the bakery to streets over. Lila broke the silence. "When I first came here, I thought you were just some man who felt sorry for me. I didn't think people actually stayed." She swallowed hard. "You stayed." Evan's throat felt tight. "And I always will. But this decision has to be yours. She nodded slowly, staring down at their joined hands. I think I need to try. I need to see if she's really changed. Evan felt the ache of loss, sharp and deep, but beneath it was something steadier, pride. She was ready to step into the world with her own feet. Then that's what you'll do, he said, voice quiet but sure. And if it doesn't work, the door's always open. Always. The tears slipped free now, but she was smiling. I'm going to miss this place. You'll visit, he said, and then, after a pause, and maybe I'll visit you.
They
Spent the rest of the morning together, making breakfast, laughing at burnt toast, washing dishes side by side. It felt almost like any other morning, and yet every glance, every touch carried the weight of goodbye. When it was time for her to leave, she stood by the doorway with her small bag. She hesitated, then stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around him. He held her just as firmly, neither wanting to be the first to let go. You changed my life, she whispered into his chest. Evan swallowed hard. You changed mine too. And with that, she stepped out into the pale sunlight. We watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller, till the city swallowed her from view. The apartment felt different without her, quieter, somehow larger. But Evan knew this wasn't an ending, it was just the next chapter for both of them. That night, as he sat by the window, a faint smile touched his lips. Somewhere out there, she was looking at the same sky. And in that thought, there was comfort, and the quiet certainty that some bonds don't break, no matter the distance.